Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying these sessions this morning. This has really been a very unique and inspiring and educational morning. I've already received a lot of feedback from people that the main feedback I've received so far is, we got to do this more often. So, Mirz Hashem, we would be happy to do it more often. As I mentioned at the outset this morning, I've been rabbi at this hospital, thank God, for almost 20 years now. It's hard to believe there was no gray at that when I started. But in these 20 years, I've gotten used to some of the types of things that come up in the role. A lot of questions come up about the kosher kitchen. A lot of questions come up about our Shabbos elevator and Shabbos in the hospital, about our morgue, about Kohanim, end-of-life questions, grief management questions, a lot of questions that I've become accustomed to. But as you might have seen when you came in this morning, there is construction happening across the street for a 10-story research tower that's going up here. That will be our third full research tower at this hospital. And there are a lot of incredible things happening. And I started saying, why aren't they asking the rabbi about these questions? These new innovations, the new research that's happening that's about to, and in some ways is already, as you've learned this morning, transforming the world and changing our very lives. These are questions for a rabbi. These questions bring up ethical, moral, theological, halachic issues. And a sensitive Jew recognizes when we see these things that we've been learning about this morning that we need guidance. Now, I can't do this myself. I need much greater guidance than myself. I have to turn to the best of the best. And I want to especially thank right now, first of all, Johnny Istrin and the Istrin family for helping to make this happen. And especially, I have a tremendous appreciation for Julie Barron-Platt, who's a Cedars-Sinai board member and a director at the Robert M. Barron Family Foundation, for believing in my vision to start exploring these issues in a serious manner. And you're going to start hearing a lot more of exploration of the halachic and moral approaches to the absolutely incredible things that are happening. And as I said, we have to turn to our wisest, our greatest leaders that Klal Yisrael has, because thank God, the Torah, Judaism, has amazing wisdom and amazing insights to guide us through these challenging issues. For me, myself, in my own life, I decided a number of years ago already, when I have a challenging question, you can't shop around and just ask different rabbis who you feel like asking that day. There has to be one final address, one final posek, the greatest of the great. And I decided in my own life that that's Rav Weiss, Shlita. And a tremendous gaon and a person with compassion and understanding of the world and massive Talmudic expertise and huge Talmud Chacham. I will say with one caveat, though. I should point out one caveat. My wife's here. One caveat. When a couple of years ago, when I matched to donate a kidney to a stranger, my first call, of course, I called Rav Weiss right away. And his immediate response to me was, "Did you ask your wife?" So there's sometimes but we recognize that Rav Weiss Shlita, I recognize in my own life, and then we realized that Klal Yisrael does the same thing. We begin to realize there has to be certain addresses, certain individuals who are capable of guiding the Jewish people. This has been clear now for a number of years, but I think it crystallized during COVID and during unfortunate recent wars when very, very heavy and challenging questions needed immediate and specific concrete guidance. And who has been the address for that guidance? We are so honored that for our inaugural conference to explore these issues, I went to his office to ask him in person about a year ago in Yerushalayim, and then thanks to Johnny Istrin's partnership and Julie Barron-Platt, we are so honored, unbelievably honored, to be able to have the schus to hear from the posek that we turn to on all these issues, Hagon Rav Weiss Shlita.
I thank my dear and precious Talmud Rabbi Weiner for his generous and somewhat exaggerated introduction. And I'm proud to be here again. I was here a year ago, I was here previously, and I'm happy to be here again. And I am moved to see the crowd coming together this morning just to learn, to be inspired, and just try to be wiser and more knowledgeable. Yes, we have been through difficult and testing times. And as Rabbi Weiner mentioned, COVID, and for the past 2.5 years, war. Unusual times bring forth unusual questions that demand sometimes unusual answers and responses. And this has been a very testing time for halachic rulers, for poskim, as me. And we will discuss this morning halachic dilemmas regarding medical research, the importance of medical research, halachic ramifications, and to me it brings to mind a question I got during the COVID period. There was a person that fell ill with COVID. He was not a firm Jew, and his children knew that he has to be cremated after Mea V'Esem, after 120. But then when he fell ill, and the whole world was scrambling to find a vaccine, and he said he is willing to donate his body to medical research, but he said either cremation or medical research. And when he passed away, and one of his kids was a frum person, an observant Jew, and the others were not observant, and they turned to their observant sibling, and he said, it's one of the two. Will you help us to decide? And he turned to me, and what would my recommendation be? What would my halachic response be if, he couldn't convince his siblings to do proper burial, and he needed to suggest what would be preferable, cremation or donating his body to medical research. And just to discuss cremation, which is a grave transgression of halacha, Tov Reish Samech Hei. I think that would be 1905, about 120 years ago. One of the prominent rabbis in Germany, Rabbi Meir Lerner was his name, and he was the Rav of Altona in Germany. And he wrote a sefer called Chaye Olam, in which he came out very powerfully against cremation. And that was a period in Germany in which so many German Jews left the fold. Many converted to Christianity, and others just left Yiddishkeit, left Orthodoxy. And a Meir Lerner compiled letters from many Gedolim, turning to the Chevra Kedishis in Germany, the burial societies, not to bury the remains of people that were cremated, because this is a violation of halacha. And many Gedolim signed off on that letter, most notably the Beis Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes, who was the greatest posek in Galicia, and Reb Chaim Oizer, who was considered the Gadol of Lithuania. And that book, that sefer, caused a big controversy. So let me share you a personal experience. I turned to a very firm Chevra Kiddush in Yerushalayim and asked them to bury the ashes of a person that was cremated. What was the story? This was a Holocaust survivor. Like both my mom and my dad, who were both survivors, like my great Rebbe, the Klosenberger Rebbe, who was the ultimate survivor, and he lost his wife and 11 children in the Holocaust. And this person was traditional, what we call in Israel Mesorati, not totally frum, but Mesorati, keeping Shabbos, definitely fasted on Yom Kippur, and the fundamentals. He had a kosher home, and his children were shocked. After he passed away, he left in his will that he wishes to be cremated out of honor to his parents that both were in the crematoriums in Auschwitz. And for some bizarre way, he thought that that'll be honoring his parents. And his children were shocked because he never spoke with them about this. Once again, most of the children weren't from. And the from one said, this is a terrible mistake. If our father would speak about this, we would explain to him that this is in no way doing good to his parents. And in no way would this be right. I mean, his parents were cremated by the Nazis. And you, Baruch Hashem, a new generation with God's mercy, and you live in Israel, and why would you do this? But the non-from children argued, but this is what our father wished us to do, and this is what we will do. And the from one could not convince them to change their mind. And I turned to the Chevra Kedisha and I said, this is not a person that didn't believe in life after death. This is not a person that didn't want to be buried. He had this tragic misunderstanding, thinking that this is a way of honoring his parents, and that should not be held to his detriment. And I think his ashes should be buried. And Baruch Hashem, they were. If you ever visit the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Krakow, one of the tombstones that you should see, the last Rav in Krakow in Poland was Reb Shmuel Kornitzer, a grandson of Rabbi Yosef Nehemiah Kornitzer, who was the son-in-law of Reb Shimon Seifer. When the Nazis came into Krakow, the Rav, Reb Shmuel Kornitzer, naively went to the offices of the Gestapo to ask the Gestapo chief to treat the Jews with dignity, treat them fairly. How naive. He never came home. And after a week, his family received a box, an urn of his ashes. And they were buried right next to the grave of his father, Rabbi Kiva Kornitzer. So if you visit the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Krakow, look for the cave of Rabbi Kiva Kornitzer, and right next to his mitzvah, there is another mitzvah. Here were buried the ashes of the last Rav of Kroka, of Krakow, Reb Shmuel Kornitzer. So that's a precedent. Sometimes ashes should be buried. But cremation is a violation of halacha. It is wrong. So you could probably guess, my psak was, if need be, then it is preferable to donate his body to medical research and not to cremation for 3 different reasons. If you donate his body to medical research, most of the body will ultimately be buried. They will use some of his internal organs, but the majority of his body will be brought to proper burial. Even the organs that will be used for research, most of them will be returned for burial. And even partial burial is a mitzvah. And that was reason number 1 that I preferred donating his body to medical research and not having him cremated. The Shoel HaMeshiv, Rabbi Yosef Shon Natanzan, who was the greatest posek going back 150 years in Lviv. Jews called that city Lemberg. He was the greatest posek in Galicia in his day and age. Madura Aleph, Chelek Aleph, Simen Reish Lamed Aleph. His opinion is that there is no Issa of Nivol Hameis when it is done Litoy Elis. If there is benefit in cutting up a cadaver, a body, that would not be a violation of halacha if there is a real need. Now, it is questionable whether medical research would fit that criteria even according to the Shoyal HaMeshiv, but there definitely is some room for leniency, better than cremation. And reason number 3 is research is important. Research saves lives. And if we need to choose between cremation and dedicating a Jewish body to research, we definitely should prefer dedicating a body to research, hoping that it'll bring some benefit. Would it be permissible to use the human Jewish body for medical research? This was a question dealt with the true greatest poskim going back 250 years. Noide B'Yehuda, Madura Tinyona, Yoredea Simen Reish Yud, was the first one to deal with this question. So Nivul Ameis is a violation of halacha. Would it be translated desecrating a human body? Sometimes I have a difficulty with translations. So how would you define Nivul Ameis in English? Defile, to defile a body. So I'm happy that I'm not so ignorant. So the Noida B'Yehuda was asked, could we define a body to enhance research? And the question presented with the Noida B'Yehuda, there was a person that had some kidney ailment, and he died, and the doctor said, we have another patient with the same condition. If we could check the kidney of the deceased, maybe we will figure out how to help that other patient. And the Noida B'Yehuda writes, Pikuach Nefesh overrides other mitzvahs only if it's Choyle B'Faneinu. So in this case, there was a Choyle B'Faneinu, but nevertheless the Noida B'Yehuda disagrees to define a human body. Hopefully, we might be able to save others. I think the case was not that they had another patient, but they said, this happens all the time, and we might figure out how to treat other patients. And the Noida B'Yehuda says, it is only when you save a life right here and now that would be defined as Pikuach Nefesh to override any other transgression. Chasam Sof Yordei Shin Lamed Vav deals with a similar question, similar but not identical. And the Chasam Sofer deals with a person that wanted to sell his body for medical research. He was to be paid, but the same question would be when a person wants to donate his body. And the Chasam Sofer reaches the same conclusion as the Noida B'Yehuda. Pikuach Nefesh is only when Choyle B'Faneinu, when the patient is here, he's real, and we need to save his life. Future Pikuach Nefesh would not be defined as Pikuach Nefesh to enable or permit overriding any issue. Comes along the Chazon Ish, Yordei Simen Reish Ches, and then the Chazon Ish argues, it doesn't really matter whether Choyle B'Faneinu or not. It is all about reasonability. So medical research not always brings results, and if it does bring results, it would be silly to assume that this specific body to be dissected will make the difference, and therefore the Chasam Sofer agrees with the Noida B'Yehuda. You cannot defile a Jewish body to enhance medical research. But the Chazon Ish argues it all depends on reasonability. And because medical research is a long shot, and we never know where this will lead, where this will go, and therefore it is not defined as Pikuach Nefesh. One of the youngest Talmidim of the Chasam Sofer was the Machne Chaim, Reb Chaim Sofer. The Chasam Sofer passed away when he was 17 years old, but he considered himself a Talmid Muvak of the Chasam Sofer. His name was Sofer, but he was not a family member, however, a disciple. And Reb Chaim Sofer Yordei Chelik Beis Simen Samach argues that he thinks by clear halachic criteria, the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer would probably be lenient, but they were concerned about what we call in modern slang a slippery slope. If we enable dissecting and defiling bodies for medical research, we have no control over how much, what type of research, where will this lead. So according to their ruling, both the Chassam Sofer and the Machne Chaim, it is not definitive that Pikuach Nefesh would only be when Choyle Bifaneinu. Many years ago, I was approached by the rabbis of Johannesburg. And Johannesburg is a very active Hatzalah organization, as every Jewish community in the world today. And I think we should all be very proud about all these Hatzalah organizations, and I'm sure we have some in LA as well, in Los Angeles, which is volunteers, and they save lives. They save lives every day. And Israel, whenever you have an emergency call, the first ones to be on the scene is Hatzalah, and they're always there before Mada. And in Johannesburg, it was more important than anywhere else in the world because the general services were very inefficient, very inadequate, and Hatzalah saved Jewish lives on a daily basis. But the government demanded that you cannot be a licensed paramedic unless you volunteer for 3 months of service in a public facility. Now, bearing in mind the situation in South Africa in those days, they had the highest rate of AIDS in the entire world. And in those years, 30 years ago, AIDS was a death sentence. No Jew would ever be treated in a public facility. They all went to private institutions. And the government insisted you need to serve 30 days without exception. And the question was, could those young, frum volunteers be Mechalel Shabbos in order to get authorized? So when the question was presented to me, there were enough Hatzalah volunteers. But it was quite clear that 5 years down the road, we would have no paramedics. As you all know, this is a very tough job and there's a lot of burnout. So usually after a few years of volunteering, people want to settle down. So right here and now, it was not a Pikuach Nefesh situation because there were volunteers doing the job. But if we won't have new licensed paramedics, then 5 years down the line, there will be no Hatzalah. And the community will pay a terrible price. So future Hatzalas Nefoshes, not right here and now, but a few years down the line, would that permit Chilul Shabbos? So if we take the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer at face value, there's no Choyle B'Faneinu. We're dealing with years from now. There would be no heter for Chilul Shabbos. According to the approach of the Chazon Ish, it is all about reasonability. Medical research, you have no idea where this is going to lead. And regarding with medical research, doesn't need to be him. Probably there will be enough bodies, other volunteers that don't have any halachic issue. Non-Jewish people that are not bound by halacha. But in the case of Johannesburg, if they won't volunteer to work in a public facility on Shabbos, there will be no paramedics down the road. And therefore, the question is, do we find sources in halacha that saving lives not right here and now, but somewhere down the line, would that permit Chilul Shabbos or violating any other Isser? And I brought 3 sources. Yes, it would. One is the Beis Yosef in Yoredei Simakuf Ayin Ches, based on a Gemara in Bava Kama. The family of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, of the Nasi, had a special heter, a special permit, l'saper kumi. And that was a certain hairstyle that was b'chukoiseyem lo telechu. And according to the B'is Yosef, that was an Isser Dioraisa, because that was a certain hairstyle that only Christian clergy used, but the family of the Nasi of Israel, to be presentable and respectable in their connections with government officials, they had a special permission. And the B'is Yosef asks, if it's an Issa D'Oraisa, what would the heter be? And he says, Pikuach Nefesh. Because sometimes there might be a governmental decree, and we need the right people in the right places who have the right connections to nullify that decree. And therefore, the heter was Pikuach Nefesh. We don't know how many people had this heter. Probably tens, dozens, who knows? And if you need to be respectfully presentable with your hairstyle, probably they had a haircut not twice a year like some Hasidim, Erev Pesach and Erev Rosh Hashanah. Probably they had a haircut once a month, I would assume. So tens or maybe hundreds of people violated the Issa D'Oraisa on a steady basis because somewhere down the line, sometimes there is a decree that might cost human lives, and we need the people in the proper places with the right connections to take care. That is one source. According to the B'is Yosef, we're dealing with an Issa D'Oraisa. The other source would be Sanhedrin Daf Chavav, dealing with working the land in Israel and Shvius, Shnasa Shmita. And the Gemara says, Meshum Arnona, Arnona are taxes. Chachomer were matir to work the fields. And Tosfos asks, but it's Issa D'Oraisa, for monetary loss, to pay taxes, to Tirutzim and Tosfos. Shvius Bisman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. It's only a rabbinical decree and not a biblical one. The other response, the other answer in Tosfos is Pikuach Nefesh. Some people won't have enough money to pay the taxes. They will be locked up. And being in a facility in those days amongst the Goyim, sometimes your life would be in danger. There is no Choyle B'Faneinu, not right here and now, but still it would be defined as Pikuach Nefesh to override an Isser D'Oraisa. In these two cases, we're not dealing with Kores, we're not dealing with Chilul Shabbos. Shvius is an Esav Lo Ta'aseh, and Bechokasem Lo Telechu is a Lo Ta'aseh. It's not as harsh as Shabbos, but it's still a D'Oraisa. And when we're dealing with a D'Oraisa, we find in Chazal, Mali Isur Lav, Mali Isur Karet. So these sources would substantiate the argument of the Chazon Ish. Does it necessarily need to be Choyle B'Faneinu? It all depends on reasonability. Is it reasonable to assume that by violating these transgressions, we will be saving lives in the future? So my tshuva to the Rabbanim in South Africa was, yes, I think there is room for leniency, but I did still feel extremely uncomfortable. And my feeling, just my intuition said, this wouldn't be right. I would not like to see young from people violating Shabbos in order to be licensed in the future. And I tell the Rabbanim, you need to turn to our friends in religious institutions, Christians and Muslims. Turn to our friends. They should use their influence. Because South Africa is a fascinating phenomenon. It is the most anti-Israeli government in the world. The entire process in The Hague, in the International Court, was spearheaded by the South African government. It is the most awful anti-Israeli government in the world. But the population is pro-Israel. And when all the campuses in the world were erupting with terrible anti-Semitism, the campuses in South Africa were totally quiet. There's a lot of crime in South Africa, but that is crime fueled by poverty. No anti-Semitism. So I said, turn to our friends, Christian clergy, the Muslims, and they should speak on our behalf. That's what they did, and they were successful. And the Jews didn't need to work on Shabbos. They were exempt from volunteering on Shabbos. So Baruch Hashem, the story had a happy end. But by halachic criteria, this is a fascinating discussion. So medical research is extremely important. If not for medical research, we would be losing millions of people in the entire world. But the question is, are we allowed to violate halachas to enhance medical research? Going back to the period of Corona, of COVID, years ago. So one of my 40 svarim is the Shalas Teshuvas Minchas Osha on COVID. And when the Sefer came out, after a year of COVID, a person approached me and he said, Rabbi, I always admired you greatly, but I didn't know that you're a prophet. That's what he told me. And I responded by saying, neither did I. Could you share with me how you reached that conclusion, why you think that I am a prophet? So he said, I'm holding this book in my hand. It's 600 pages. I'm sure you started writing the Sefer 4 years ago. How did you know that COVID is coming? So obviously you're a prophet. And I told him, you disappointed me. No, obviously I'm not a prophet. And I did not start writing this Sefer 4 years ago, but when questions pile up on your desk and you need to answer, then you just do your best and you have siyata d'shmaya. And with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's help, we hope that we come up with the right answers and the right responses. So at that time, I was asked by a researcher working not in Cedars-Sinai, but in Mount Sinai, similar, in New York. And he was on a team working on the vaccine, and he asked me, could I go to work on Shabbos? So the whole world was scrambling to find a viable vaccine for COVID. But nevertheless, my ruling was, don't go to work on Shabbos. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of researchers working on this project. I did not feel that your contribution working dafka on Shabbos would really make the difference. So on one hand, medical research is extremely important and we should appreciate that. We should appreciate that. So medicine is not only about choyle befanenu, it is not only about here and now. I mean, our future depends on the advancement of medical research, but in halachic ruling, we need to be very cautious and very careful and come up with a right halachic ruling. So I did not feel that this individual working on Shabbos would really make the difference. So we discussed various different questions about the validity, the importance of medical research. And one final comment that I would like to make is, and I said this many times, defining pikuach nefesh for the individual is different than defining pikuach nefesh when we're dealing on the macro level, not on the micro level, public health. And when we're dealing with public health, we take no risks. So people sign up to donate bone marrow. The likelihood of you being a donor for any individual person is extremely remote. But the likelihood of your bone marrow saving a person somewhere out there is quite high. So one of the problems we have in halachic sources is for hundreds of years, we always dealt with questions in the micro level, not on the macro level, but this is a new world out there. Today we have huge communities. It's an interconnected world. We run a state in Israel, and running a country is not an experience we had for more than 2,000 years. Since the days of HaMelech Shlomo in Yerushalayim, not even in the days of Weiss did we run the country. The Jews had a very limited autonomy, but the Romans were in Israel, and they ran the show. And today, we need to make decisions on the macro level, and we have very few sources. Could we run an army based on halacha? A medical establishment based on halacha? So poskim like me have so many real dilemmas in halacha, and not always do we find clear sources to deal with those dilemmas. And that is one of the great challenges of halachic rulers and poskim today. So I have the honor to be the posek of Shaarei Tzedek, and I am here together with Rabbi Sprung, who is the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek, the equivalent of Rabbi Weiner in this halachic, in this medical institution. And we are associated with many other medical facilities in Israel and throughout the world. And I also serve the entire security establishment in Israel, which would be the army and the police force and the Mossad and the Shabak, and they turn to me from time to time with their questions. And these are real halachic dilemmas that we need to respond to. So it is a huge privilege and also an awesome responsibility. And every day when we open up our Gemara, we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shelo Nikosha B'Devar Halacha. So it's an honor for me to be here this morning with you, Rabbi Weiner. Thank you for initiating this beautiful event. And I too want to thank Johnny Easterin for having me here and all our precious friends here. And we should always find the right approach and the right answers to the many halachic dilemmas we need to deal with. And let us hope that in Israel we could come back to Sheva Brachas questions, to Natilas Yadayim questions, and all the other friendly and pleasant shaylas in halacha. This war should be over very soon because nobody knows where it's going. And in the past 5 years, we've been through 2 very challenging periods, as I said in the opening comments of today's lecture. The period of the pandemic and now war. And there might be a minchas osher on questions that came up during this war. Who knows? Maybe. So thank you for having me today, and Baruch Hashem, keep up your holy work.
It's okay. Rabbi should answer a couple of questions. Okay.
Okay.
I'll just ask the Rav a couple of questions that came up today, and we'll ask him to respond. One question that we heard about a lot was with genome sequencing, predicting the future with genetics. And one question we have for the Rav is about Tamim Tiyeh and Hashem Elokecha. When do we have to be progressive in trying to find new answers and trying to figure out the future? And when should we be relying on HaKadosh Baruch Hu and being a little bit more pure and just allowing the future to happen as happened in the past?
Rabbi Weiner, you phrased the question Should we just rely on things to happen as it happened in the past? That definitely would not be a very sensible approach. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the ability, we believe in providence, we believe in Hashgacha. And I think we should assume that every medical, technological breakthrough that the human mind comes up with is directed from above. And if we have the ability today to advance science, technology, and medicine, it is something we need to do. Tomem tia im Hashem Elokecho, in its original context in the Torah, regards to fortune tellers, to sorcerers, to Harry Potter and his friends, not to medicine and not to medical research. So yes, you shouldn't go to fortune tellers. And in Sefer Hasidim, I think it is us Reish Hey, but I didn't prepare my answers to these questions. I think it's in Reish Hey in Sefer Hasidim. He says, because these future tellers are usually inaccurate, and you cannot even know whether they know what they're talking about. So, Tomem tia im Hashem Elokecho doesn't mean that you should just stick to the past. And I think advancing medical knowledge is imperative. It's a mitzvah, and in no way does it go against Tomem tia im Hashem Elokecho. There's also a difference between the individual and, once again, caring for public health. So, years ago, and I do not recall whether I shared this with the wonderful people here in Cedars-Sinai, but I discussed the question statistically, how do we define pikuach nefesh? And there seems to be a contradiction in the Mogan Avraham between Shin Tezayin and Shin Lamed. So, a yoledes is defined as a choyle sheyesh b'sakana. A woman having a baby during childbirth is a choyle sheyesh b'sakana. And we violate Shabbos to tend to her every need. And she is considered as one whose life is in danger. And the Maggid Mishnah says we need to do a shini because 1 out of 1,000 doesn't die. That's a strange number. Going back 800 years to the days of the Maggid Mishnah, or almost 2,000 years to the days of Chazal, my feeling is that far more than 1 out of 1,000 perished. But the Maggid Mishnah says 1 out of 1,000, and it still is defined as pikuach nefesh. And then there's the other Mogan Avraham in Shin Tezvav. Could you kill a spider on Shabbos? So people were always afraid of spiders, especially Noshim Tzedkoniyos. And for some reason, people were afraid of spiders. Most spiders are friendly creatures. Some of them aren't. The big tarantulas are not. The black widow spider is a tiny one, but it's dangerous. But most of them are friendly. So the Mogan Avraham says, but the spider might creep up the wall, onto the roof, you fall into your chunt, and you won't realize it, and you're going to eat it, and then your life will be in jeopardy. So the Mogan Avraham says, 1 out of 1,000 is not pikuach nefesh. So by Yoledes, he says 1 out of 1,000 is pikuach nefesh. And here he says 1 out of 1,000 is not pikuach nefesh. It's exactly the same figure, exactly the same number. The difference is a very simple one. The difference is between coincidence. You see a spider on the floor. What are the chances that little spider will creep up the wall, onto the roof, and suddenly he's going to lose his footing and he's going to fall into your plate and you won't notice it? That's not pikuach nefesh. But women have babies all the time. 1 out of 1,000 is too much. So, b'derech moshel, I say, Shaarei Tzedek, our hospital that we're so proud of, leads Israel in the numbers of, Baruch Hashem, babies born throughout the year. We lead the Middle East. I assume maybe we lead the world. I don't know. But we lead the Middle East. Let's imagine that 500 babies are born every day. 3,500 babies are born every week. And every week, we lose one woman during childbirth. Would we do everything, including Chilul Shabbos, to save that woman? Or would we say 3,499 mothers came happily home with their babies? Only one died. The only relevant number is that one. The 3,499 that came safely home, that's an irrelevant number. So there's a difference between public health and coincidence for the individual. And that's the difference between the spider story and the Yoledes. So I think when dealing with public health and the advance of research, that has nothing to do with Tomem Tiyem Hashem Elokecho. And therefore, I strongly support screening. I strongly support screening. And you need to follow doctors' recommendations. When you reach a certain age, you should have a colonoscopy. Women should have the mammograms. You should. Screening saves lives. And sometimes when we become aware of a disease, it is tragically too late. So I strongly recommend, and that does not go against Tomem Tia Im Hashem Elokecho. Don't become hysterical. Don't just try to do every test in the books, but follow doctors' recommendations. Early detection saves lives, especially when we're dealing with cancer, and sometimes by the time we become aware of an illness, it is tragically late. So advancing medical research is imperative. It's a mitzvah. And also screening, and sometimes genetic screening. When there's reason to believe that there might be genetic issues, I strongly recommend screening in a sensible fashion, in a responsible fashion, not becoming hysterical. But yes, caring for your health and advancing medical research in no way goes against Tomem Tiyem Hashem Elokecho.
And just one last question we'd like to ask the Rav. Rabbi Siegelman's wonderful presentation this morning, he left a number of his questions unanswered. And he said when the Rav Asher Weiss gets here today, we could ask him. So if it's okay, people will want to know. Specifically, PGD. When is it okay for a person to do PGT, especially for late onset conditions like BRCA? Should a couple do PGT? Should they avoid that? When is it right to do halachically?
So first of all, thank you, Rabbi Siegelman. Rabbi Siegelman is also a great, wonderful Talmid Chacham that I know for many, many years. So thank you for being here, and thank you for keeping me busy. So I don't know whether everybody knows what PGD is. When we do IVF, there's a possibility of doing PGD, which would be checking the embryos, whether they have any genetic problems, and then we will use the others. But PGD is only recommended when the reason to do IVF is because there are some genetic concerns. But that is when we initiate but PGD could be done even when there is no special concern, because if we already did IVF and we have a variety of embryos, we would like to be confident that we're choosing the ones that don't have any genetic mutations. And I think that definitely could be recommended. But you are aware that sometimes PGD would impair the embryos. And when we have few embryos, and not always would it be recommendable to do PGD unless there is a need, because there is a concern, a genetic concern that there might be genetic mutations. regarding the BRCA gene, and this is a question I've been asked on a steady basis. When a woman becomes aware that she does carry this gene, should she do preventive surgery or not? And I say it is not a halachic obligation. But so what I say now is not a psak, but I do recommend taking measures and to give you the best chance for a long and healthy life. So I always tell people life is more precious than anything else. And I do not think that a woman that has the BRCA gene needs to undergo preventive surgery, but it is something that I would recommend to people that I love and people I care about. So PGD, once again, is one of those amazing breakthroughs, and I believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the wisdom and the ability to screen embryos before returning them to the uterus. It should be recommended. Thank you all for being here today, and it's an inspiration to me.